that you're in the right place if you're here for part 2 of From Protest to Power, Electeds Enacting Policy. And we're going to give everyone just 1 or 2 more minutes to join. Hang tight.
Form of glorious combat. Battle is the great redeemer.
All right, everybody, going to give guests 1 more minute and then we're going to get started. All right, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to part 2 of From Protest to Power, Electeds Enacting Policy. My name is Samantha Kelly, and I'm the Treasurer and Executive Committee member of the Massachusetts Women's Political Caucus Political Action Committee, affectionately known as the MWPC PAC. I'm joined tonight by Caitlin Clark and Amy Diamond, who are the co-chairs. Caitlin, Amy, give a quick wave. I first want to thank them and the MWPC PAC interns who have been working so hard on this event tonight. And thank you all for joining us this evening for the second installment in our 2-part series. This year, we have seen an extraordinary mobilization of Americans from all walks of life, protesting against police killings, and like you, advocating for anti-racism. This event is aimed at trying to figure out how we can get from protests and activism to legislation and political change. So a bit of background about us. The MWPC PAC is a nonpartisan organization that recruits, trains, and seeks to elect qualified women to public office in order to achieve political parity, something that's important to all of us here. Our goal is to offer programs to increase the interest of women of all ages in the political process and help them to become successful in the political arena. This year, the MWPC PAC endorsed 49 candidates, 22 of whom were new endorsements, and 37 of whom are going on to their general elections on November 3rd. 100% of the proceeds of this fundraiser are going directly to those candidates. And we're so grateful for your donations. And if you can, please consider donating again or ask others to donate. And if you're watching the recording of this event and find our mission and these women inspiring, please donate. We need you. Now, last week, we heard from community activists and speakers about how to be effective advocates. We heard remarks from Boston City Councilor Julia Mejia, Shirley Edgerton, founder of the Women of Color Giving Circle in Western Massachusetts, and Dimple Rana, Director of Healthy Community Initiatives in the city of Revere. Now that we've learned how to engage people, tonight's event will feature 4 extraordinary women who are all elected officials who enact a variety of types of policies. They have each been responsible for turning activism into political change and legislation on various issues, and all of them have been previously endorsed by the MWPC PAC. Each speaker will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, followed by a brief opportunity for guests to ask questions after each of them have spoken. Thank you to those who submitted questions through our Google form. If you have any new questions for our speakers, please feel free to ask them in the Zoom chat box during and at the end of the presentation, and we will try to get through as many as possible. And a few other housekeeping items. You may notice you have all been muted. This is so we can minimize background noise and keep the focus on our speakers. Tonight's event is also being recorded, so we can post it on our website for anyone who wasn't able to attend, or if you want to watch it again for tips from our speakers. If you'd like to screenshot and post, we invite you to use hashtag from protest to power, and I popped it in the chat a little bit earlier if you'd like to copy and paste. Now, I will briefly introduce each of the speakers in turn before they give their remarks, and more detailed bios can be found on our event website. But first, let's try something together, some virtual applause. So if you'd like, please unmute just for a moment and please give a round of welcoming applause for our speakers. Thank you. Without further ado, our first speaker is Suffolk County District Attorney, Rachel Rollins. Rachel Rollins was born into a large multicultural family whose parents met shortly after the United States Supreme Court issued its decision in Loving versus Virginia. While in college at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, she was instrumental in helping coordinate lawyers for a Title IX lawsuit that successfully won and helped reinstate all women's sports teams that were cut. Rachel then went on to receive her Juris Doctorate at Northeastern University School of Law, and then a Master's of Law at Georgetown University Law Center. She then went on to work as a field attorney at the National Labor Relations Board in Boston, then joined the law firm of Bingham McCutcheon, where she participated in a district attorney rotation in Plymouth County. Later in 2007, Rachel became an assistant United States attorney. In 2011, Rachel became the first person of color to serve as the general counsel of the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. She was then voted to become the first female general counsel of the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. In 2013, she became the chief legal counsel of the Massachusetts Port Authority. And in 2018, Rachel was elected as the district attorney of Suffolk County, becoming the first woman to serve as DA in Suffolk County and the first woman of color in Massachusetts to serve as a DA. Please join me in welcoming Suffolk County District Attorney Rachel Rollins.
Thank you so much. I want to make sure, can you guys see me and hear me okay? Excellent. So good evening. It is an honor to be here with you guys tonight, and thank you for extending this invitation. I love being in a room full of women, or where we say now a Zoom full of women, right? But there's a sense of sisterhood, solidarity, shared struggle and triumph, even if there's not shared experience or goals. And here's the thing, this experience is very rare. So often in my current role as the district attorney, the chief law enforcement officer in Suffolk County, I am the only woman in any given room I enter. And when you're the only, you often feel a responsibility and a burden to speak for the group. But I can't speak for all women. I can't speak for all women of color or all Black women. We each have our own lived experience, our own perspectives, our own way of moving through the world. And that's why we need to lead, why we need to speak up and stand out, because who we are will always inform what we do and how we do it. Events like tonight's are a reminder of women's tremendous capacity to lead, and I think our individual successes are amplified by our collective resolve. I truly believe that empowered women empower women. As Suffolk County's first female DA and Massachusetts's first female district attorney of color, I feel the pressure of being the first. I feel the pressure to enact the change I promised and to fight a system designed to function for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many. I know the stakes are high, literally life or death, when you're the chief law enforcement officer. But I take comfort in knowing that women have a unique ability to drive change. We have always paved the path towards success. We've demanded the right to vote when so many wanted us silenced. We organized boycotts and sit-ins in the segregated South when so many wanted us to move to the back of the bus. We argued for equal pay for equal work in front of the highest court in the nation, and then were selected to serve as a member of that very body. And may Justice Ginsburg's memory be a blessing and a revolution. I'm wearing my RGB shirt today, which is just gorgeous, and very happy and proud to rock it. Women have, against all odds, pushed for change. Some women have benefited more from that change. Race, class, gender identity, orientation, ethnicity have made those victories qualified for many women, particularly Black women. Remember that when the 19th Amendment was passed, it did not grant suffrage to all women, only certain women. There are complexities of having an intersectional identity that continue to inform women's experience of equality and justice. Breonna Taylor knows this all too well. I decided to run for office because I was tired. It seemed like every time I turned on my television, there was an officer-involved shooting. Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Laquan McDonald, Freddie Gray. And now as district attorney, that list continues to grow. George Floyd, Elijah McClain, Ahmaud Arbery, Jonathan Price, Jacob Blake, who yes, lived, but is permanently disabled. There is an epidemic of violence against Black and brown and poor communities, but so often that conversation focuses exclusively on the murders of Black men. Since 2015, 48 Black women have been killed by the police. About 5 days after the death of 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, 50-year-old Michelle Crusoe was shot and killed within seconds of the police encountering her during a mental health call. Black trans women suffer a disproportionate level of violence and murder, not just from police, but from those who devalue their lives, their identity, their very, very existence, and their stories. These women matter. Their lives matter. They should be remembered. We should work for change in their memory. Kimberly Crenshaw is a Black feminist academic who first coined the term intentionality. She saw how Black women were being forgotten within the broader movement for change, which is why she started the Say Her Name campaign. She said, and I quote, "It is the reality of living life in a Black body that makes you more subject to police violence. Now, if that body happens to be gendered as something other than male, it also makes you vulnerable to being misremembered." The civil rights movement did wonders for Black men. The women's suffrage era did wonders for white women. Where's the movement for Black women, for brown women, for Indigenous women, for Asian women? We must remember Breonna Taylor, Taisha Miller, Rakia Boyd, Chantel Davis, Miriam Carey, Kendra James, Sandra Bland. We must speak loudly against injustice and oppression when we see it. Then we must use every resource at our disposal to dismantle those systems and rebuild with an eye toward equity and equality for all, not just the privileged few. Prosecutors are uniquely positioned to shake up the system. We have a responsibility to serve the community that includes victims, witnesses, their families and neighbors, the community, and defendants. Yes, I said defendants, because defendants and their families are also part of the community and the Commonwealth. And anyone who does this work and does it well and actually knows what they're talking about knows that today's defendant is tomorrow's witness or yesterday's victim. That includes all people of all races, of all gender identities, orientations, and ethnicities in our Commonwealth. As we embrace that perspective, if we understand the collateral consequences of our decisions and how they reverberate throughout the community, then we can start exploring the best way to ensure public safety. Accountability does not always require incarceration. Wealth should never dictate liberty. Treatment should not be subordinate to punishment. I want to explore meaningful reform around mental health, substance use, food and housing insecurity, trauma, and poverty. It is not just the smart thing to do, it's the right thing to do. I am desperately trying to change a system that was created by and for people who do not look like me, but with people like me directly in mind. I have siblings who have cycled in and out of the criminal justice system and who have struggled with substance use disorders and mental health issues. I am the guardian of 2 of my nieces because of those realities. Criminal injustice is not something I learned about by reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. I have lived this experience. I still do. Our nation's racial history is very ugly and runs deep. It is not just our original sin, it is our mutating virus. We went from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. And I like to say that Black people helped build this country. Our blood is in its soil. If we truly want to heal, though, everyone in our country, we need to confront the underlying wound. Funding programs and passing policies while failing to talk about racial injustice is like putting a very small Band-Aid on a gaping, bleeding wound. It will not stop the bleeding. It will not help to heal. We need to talk about race and how it influences our systems and policies. We need to confront our past in order to build a much more just and equitable future. I sincerely hope you join me in this fight. We could use all of the help we can get. Thank you very much.
Thank you, District Attorney Rollins. Wow. Well, now we're going to turn over to some questions from our guests. So if you have a question, please feel free to unmute or you can put it in the chat and we can read it out. But one question that we had sent in on the Google Forms is, what are some of the concrete steps you think need to be taken to adequately reform the police system?
Reform the police system, you said?
Yes.
So one of the things that can absolutely happen, I hope soon, is our legislature acting on all of the current proposals that are before it. So we know that the governor has made a proposal, the House and the Senate. There's joint committee was allegedly urgently moving toward coming to a solution. July 31st has come and gone, and we are still waiting with bated breath to see what's going to happen. If any of you have read the Globe today, the governor is pointing at the legislature is pointing back at the governor, talking about alleged reforms that need to be made with respect to the state police and other policing reforms. We have Mayor Walsh in Boston, who has created a task force that came up with a 17-page proposal that the mayor has adopted 100%. But what does that mean? When do those go into effect, right? Words matter. And I have been a victim of the okey doke too many times to now when people say things, I'm like, yeah, hold on, no. Let me interrupt you right now. What does that mean? When does this happen? How does this come into place? Because to be very clear, all of the people proposing these changes, all of the people foot dragging aren't the ones that are losing in the system, right? And I need to be very, very clear. The system is not broken. It's working exactly the way it was set up to operate and work. We're poor people, and that is the biggest group of people that lose in the criminal legal system. If you are white and poor, you will have a worse outcome than if you are black and rich. Period, end of story. The second biggest group of people that lose are black and brown people overwhelmingly, or people of color, or the, others that other people like to call them, right? And we are now the majority, by the way, for anyone who's taking count. But what I will say to you is that I am not optimistic about what it is we are looking for, because foot dragging and, patience ends up with the status quo remaining, right? I am done with waiting for things. We are in a time where things need to be urgent. It's why I have said, with the autonomy that I have now in Suffolk County, this is what I'm requiring. And you can be a state trooper wherever you want in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You just can't be one here if you have a criminal history, if you are sexually assaulting people, if you should have been fired from your boss or by your boss and haven't been yet. I can't fire you, but what I can say is, if a police report has your name on it, we aren't prosecuting that case, okay? So who are your elected officials? How are they using their power? And what I will end with in this question is, it takes a spine of steel to do that, right? I'm 49. I'm a cancer survivor. I've been through a divorce. I like to tell people, nothing that the governor, the secretary of EOPS, police unions, or any of the other men that are coming for me at any given point, that they can say or do is worse than me going through breast cancer and thinking I was going to die. So I have the resolve. But it takes, for some of these younger elected officials that are thinking about their future. If I were leading as the DA, thinking about what my next job would be or my political aspirations, I wouldn't say 95% of the things I'm saying right now, because it's not safe to say those things, right? Everyone wants to play this game of, the governor's really tall and very handsome, and both of those things might be true to some people, but you haven't made these changes, right? You are about to appoint 2 new justices on our Supreme Judicial Court that has 7 people, and you will have appointed all 7, Governor Baker, right? We haven't had a clemency in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 23 years. You have the ability to, with the stroke of a pen, get people out of jail without me fighting tooth and nail to do it. When we see these COVID outbreaks, the governor can decide things instantly. These are important roles, and the governor is a very good man. We don't agree on everything, but I'm not interested in the niceties, because in my job, I don't show up to dog park openings, ice cream shop, events. I want to, but when I'm there, it's because someone was murdered or raped at an ice cream store. My job is all urgency, all crisis, all trauma, all violence, all harm, almost all the time. So although I smile in my personal life, I promise you I do, I am deadly serious about the work we do, because it's poor people and black and brown people and indigenous people and trans and Muslims and Jews. We are hate crimes are high. We are not getting the services and treatment we deserve from our government, and I am going to speak out loud about that every single day.
Thank you so much. And for those of us on the line who are learning about the process and the bill that you're referring to in the legislature, could you tell us a little bit more about it, maybe the number or name, and how we should refer to it when we are contacting our local state reps and senators?
Yeah, so right now, my understanding is that there is the joint committee, which Senator Sonia Chang Diaz and several others are on. If you are interested in notifying them of what you would like, I can absolutely try to put in the chat some information about that. And I'll see if somebody from my team is on the call. I mean, some of the governor's proposals seemed revolutionary. Like, for example, the police are now going to have to be licensed. Let me be clear, ladies. Your electrician, you see this lighting that makes me look like I'm 10 years younger than if I turn this off, like an elderly woman would appear here and like you'd be all scared and running away. But that lighting, or if your fabulous hair, like the people that cut your hair and fix your lights, all licensed. There are 160 different classifications of jobs where you need a license in order to do it. Police officers aren't one of them. And remember, your hairdresser can give you terrible highlights or bad bangs. They can't kill you, right? Police have the legal and lethal authority to kill with no oversight. So you bet I hold them to a high standard, because there are certain things where, oops, I'm sorry, doesn't bring your loved one back. Even if I charge that officer criminally, and even if you are able to sue the city and get money afterwards. So Breonna Taylor's family did get several $1 million. Breonna's never coming back, right? We've seen now that the judge has released the grand jury transcripts, that the attorney general did not in fact present homicide charges to the grand jurors. You know, there are things where we have to hold people to a higher standard. So I'm proud of Governor Baker for demanding that our police be licensed, but we are one of 2, 3, or 4 states out of 50 plus in our nation, right, and districts that don't license our police officers. We are well behind the curve there. I think there's also, you know, the sort of post committee that was talked about, where there's going to be not only licensing, but if officers get in trouble, it goes up to that entity, which can then discipline them, right? Or say you will no longer be able to get your license in order to be a police officer. Some of the other things on a federal level, ladies, that is problematic is when we think about, and I don't care what anyone's political affiliations are, but this is fact. After President Trump appointed Jeff Sessions as the Attorney General, so the Maura Healey of the nation, right? Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and let's hope one day it is Attorney General Maura Healey, but that's a different story, okay? So as in United States Attorney General Maura Healey. Jeff Sessions, the first thing he did as the U.S. Attorney General is stop the Office of Civil Rights under the Department of Justice from enforcing pattern and practice violations at police departments. So let's think through this. As the federal government up here, they look down at all of the different police departments across the nation, and they say, Baltimore, Detroit, Ferguson, Chicago, you are the worst of the worst. You have chronic violations, you have acute problems of excessive force, racial profiling, all of these things. The federal government put them under what's called a consent decree, requiring them to have monitors in there. And the hook that we had as the federal government was saying, okay, Chicago, you don't want to do that? It's your prerogative. But you see this $30 million we normally give you every year for your police department? We're not giving you that funding anymore. The first things Jeff Sessions did was pull all of the Office of Civil Rights pattern and practice cases and say to those police departments, you don't need federal regulators. You can regulate yourself on your own. So I have several children. If I asked my 7-year-old to put herself in a timeout, she wouldn't, right? Like she'd continue eating, you know, fruit snacks and drinking juice boxes and not listening and lying to me, right? That's exactly what's going to happen to these police officers or police departments, I'm sorry. So that's a problem. And then also the federal government now just requires a voluntary notification process regarding officer-involved shootings and other things. So less than 40% of the law enforcement across the country responded. So we don't even have the right data to look at this problem. It's a reason why I'm okay, even as one of 11 elected district attorneys in Massachusetts, to have the Attorney General of Mass, Maura Healey. If I have to report up to Maura every time there's an officer-involved shooting in Suffolk County, when I had meetings about it, what my outcomes are, I think that's appropriate, because she is up here looking down at the entire state and would be able to say, you know, okay, Rachel, why are your numbers so high? They should only be this. What are you looking at here, right? And we can, with oversight, I think we get better.
And we have one question from Sarah Markham. She asks, what other steps can we take aside from calling our state reps?
I do like Maura Healey for governor first, or at some point too. So I'm all in. But what are the other steps you can take? You can educate yourself about what these policies are and whether it is doing things like this. You know, there are several things happening right now on the state level. So as we talked about, Joint Committee is currently meeting, we are told. We've heard nothing yet, number one. We have, as I said to you before, Mayor Walsh in Boston had his task force, the 17-page report that they came out with, that the mayor just last week said, I agree to all of it, but there's no timeline, there's no, you know, step-by-step process of how this is enacted, who is on, you know, the civilian review board, who are the commissioners going to be, what is the process there. I think we need to be much better about that. And then we have 3 counselors on the Boston City Council that are actively looking or having hearings about an executive order regarding policing. So it is Councilor Andrea Campbell, it is Councilor Arroyo and Councilor Mejia. So there are lots of things moving in that direction as well. And then Ayanna Pressley and several others on the federal level have many matters that they are moving forward regarding these issues, right? Massachusetts is leading the way right now regarding qualified immunity and what we are going to look at there regarding some of those changes. So I would see if, you know, some of our state reps or your state rep hopefully has a 1 or 2 pager write-up of what Governor Baker's executive summary of what his proposal was, an executive summary of what the House proposal was, and an executive summary of what the Senate proposal was, so that you can see, well, wait a minute, I like almost if you could do an a la carte, right? I like these 3 things that the governor said, but not this. I like this one thing that the House proposed, but not those. And I like all this stuff from the Senate, but not that. And then you can be more fluent. And then honestly, I would encourage you, if you know and love police officers or know and love somebody that has touched the criminal legal system, either in a positive way, whether through, you know, working in the system, or a negative way, whether going through the system potentially, and start having some interesting conversations with them about what would they change if they could. I think if we're honest, and if any police officer, even one that 180 degrees disagreed with everything I said, and we mutually disagreed with each other, we would both agree that we are currently asking the police to do far too much. Far too much, right? They didn't sign up for half of this. And if we are honest, when people come in contact with the criminal legal system, it is after multiple societal failures, right? Not a single one of you got to choose who you were born to, whether you were adopted or not, which often dictates where you live, where you go to school, what your environment is like. And environmental racism is very real, right? I look at Chelsea and say, you know, a working class, beautiful place, but the people of Chelsea didn't have time to sit up and protest all day. They were busy working and trying to live when the Tobin Bridge was put up in Chelsea, when Logan Airport flies planes through Chelsea all the time, and when that private food distribution center that's one of the largest in the US, that has tons of 18-wheelers driving through it, they didn't have the time that maybe a Wellesley, a Winchester, a Waban, a Weston, or some of our wealthier W towns, where people who don't work and have tons of time can picket and argue all day because they're not essential workers who are keeping us alive, working at food distribution centers, supermarkets, hospitals, sanitation locations, or in transportation. These individuals are also homeschooling their children, right? Many of whom are on IEPs and English language learners. The gap in our education system is widening every day that we move forward, right? So I think we have to be much better at explaining. There are a lot of disparities that happen that are no fault of our own, right? And I don't want to be part of a system where I am considered a failure at one, right? Or when we look at where I'm born, what my zip code is, what my race is, and who my parents are, and that dictates virtually everything. There are all these societal failures that happen prior to somebody coming into contact with the criminal legal system. How I'm different than my colleagues is they say, well, then bother them about it. I'm just here to prosecute. If you have a DA that doesn't understand the importance of housing, period, hard stop, that doesn't understand that the best deterrent to crime is a good education and a trauma-free life. And if you ask rich, privileged children what keeps you safe, they would never say the police, right? Or when I hear people talk about school resource officers in our schools, you know, in our public schools here, and they say, no, 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 they're just like social workers and, you know, like psychiatrists. No, they aren't. Social workers are social workers, right? If you told my parents, and I graduated from Buckingham, Brown and Nichols, or all of my wealthy classmates, we're gonna take out 2 of your AP English classes because we want some police officers to make sure that they're frisking down the kids when they come, you'd be fired before the sentence even got out of your mouth, right?
Yeah.
I just want everyone treated the same in the system.
Yeah. Well, DA Rollins, thank you so much for all of your time spent with us tonight. Really had some inspiring things to say. And honestly, I know all of us are raring to go to talk to our reps and our senators about that bill that everyone's dragging their feet on. So I see that Senator Joe Comerford put a little extra information in the group chat. Please do refer to that. Thank you. And we're going to wrap up and head to our next speaker.
Excellent. Thank you so much. You are left in wonderful hands. Hello, Chelsea. Lovely. Good to see you. Thank you, ladies. Bye-bye.
Thank you. All right, our next speaker is State Senator Joe Comerford. Joe Comerford graduated from Hunter College School of Social Work in New York and then moved to Western Massachusetts in the late 1990s to help lead a crisis intervention outreach team through the Center for Human Development. She worked for 7 years as the director of the Western Massachusetts American Friends Service Committee and then as a director of programs at the Food Bank of Western Massachusetts. After the Food Bank, Joe led the National Priorities Project as its executive director, followed by 4 years as a campaign director for Move On. Currently, Joe is serving in her first term as state senator for the Hampshire, Franklin, and Worcester district. Please join me in welcoming State Senator Joe Comerford.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Hello, everyone. I am fired up by DA Rollins. Really grateful to the Massachusetts Women's Political Caucus for inviting me to join an incredible panel. I have slides which I think will come up. Yep, there we are. I'm nearing the end of my first session in the State Senate, where I've been the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Public Health. And I want to just say this right now. It was true at the beginning of this session and only grew in urgency with the COVID-19 pandemic, that systemic, unbridled, institutionalized racism is a public health crisis. And that's how I viewed the work in the Public Health Committee. And then again, that only intensified as I grew to lead the Senate's COVID-19 response. I'm honored to be among you and excited for tonight's conversation focused on using policy to codify, to lock in meaningful change in the fight to end, to uproot, to eradicate racism. So the first slide, policy is people power in law. And it feels like it's a good segue from what the DA was saying. Why start here, right? Because before taking office, I was an organizer. My job was to marshal people power, to hold lawmakers like me accountable. I believe there is absolutely nothing stronger than a diverse, informed, engaged, and active electorate on the move for justice. I believed that as an organizer, and that belief is only deepened now that I serve in the state Senate. People make the legislature work, and it makes it work better, people power. Policy that represents the interests of the greatest diversity of people and advocates, wrought by their organizing, is stronger, more resilient, more just. Again, this is what I believed when I used to teach lobbying, to move government at the national, state, and local level. And it's true now that I'm inside the building. Constituents of color, organizations led by people of color, have been always explicit about what they need and desire. And it's up to us, up to me as an elected official, to listen and to respond. And I believe this is a foundational principle. If we could go to the second slide. So some of the policies I'll talk about would be new in the legislature and explicitly about racial justice and equity. Others are reforms to policy and the way we make policy. These are attempts to address disparate impacts on communities of color with regard to a particular issue. And some have to do with funding. And here I always keep Congresswoman Barbara Lee's words in my head that budgets have to be moral documents, not that they are, but they have to be. They should reflect our values in numbers. Where we spend money is what we value. So one note just before I dive in, I'll only be listing a few initiatives, ones that I have connection to or important to my constituents. There are many more, as you likely know, before the legislature, but in the interest of time, I'll narrow in. So first, let's talk about building new policy. And the DA talked about this really well and added the urgency. So I was appointed to the Senate's Racial Justice Task Force, and one of the first pieces of legislation we took up was the Reform, Shift, and Build Act, the police reform work. So we viewed this as a police reform and racial equity bill designed to increase police accountability, shift the role of law enforcement away from surveillance and punishment and toward de-escalation and assistance, and to begin to dismantle systemic racism. So that's how the committee on which I worked viewed this bill. As a member of that committee, I focused actually on something the DA talked about, which is, and this is especially needed now in the wakes of the recent brutal murders. I worked specifically on provisions to change how we respond to emergency 911 calls when armed police response is not appropriate. So I worked to really dramatically expand the mental health provisions inside current law. So as we discussed, this is in conference now. I put the names of the conferees in the chat. I'm happy to answer more questions. So that's an example of a new policy. Another example of a new policy came out of the committee I chaired, the Senate's working group. And this was COVID-19 data collection. Now, this at first seems like a snoozer, right? Why are you talking about data when we talk about racial equity? Well, we can't see an issue. You can't address an issue unless you see it. And data is one of the ways, one of the tools that the state uses to see into a particular issue. So we know that Latino and Black communities suffered disproportionately higher infection rates and death tolls during the pandemic. And one of the connections that the DA made so importantly was the connection between environmental justice and COVID-19, because there's also the connection that the Attorney General made that looks at the fact that EJ communities intersect with communities of color, and that's where the higher death tolls, the higher infection rates, the longer hospitalization stays were. So we passed a bill, an act addressing COVID-19 data collection and disparities in treatment, and it called into law data that the state hadn't been collecting and publishing and making available publicly, that looked at data on hospitalizations where they were, deaths by race, ethnicity, age, disability, language, occupation. The administration has been implementing these slower than I'd like, but it is the beginning of a data dashboard that I believe will help us both meet the current COVID-19 crisis now, and we have to do that still, and then look at the ways in which institutional racism is, as I began, a public health crisis. And we'll have the data to narrow us in on that. And the last I'll talk about in terms of new policy is a bunch of bills under what's called the Indigenous Agenda. These are the leading tribal nations in the Commonwealth. They've called the attention of the legislature to changing the state's racist flag and seal, banning Native mascots, and several other bills, including changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. And these, again, led by Indigenous leaders, Indigenous nations over decades, have been calls to action for us. I'm happy to say that the flag and seal bill, after 40 years, and it's just shameful that it took us that long, passed the Senate. I'm a proud lead co-sponsor on that. I'm also the lead co-sponsor and the filer of the mascot bill. And it is unbelievable how much of a barrier it is to passing a bill that would take away the ability to have a racist mascot in a school community, take it out of the local level, make it a state job. And I believe that the state has an ethical responsibility to safeguard the human and civil rights of constituents. We can't cede that responsibility to school committees or city councils or select boards. So those are examples of new policy. I'll get now to amending existing policy, some examples and regulations. Inside the climate bill, which is also in conference, there's a new provision, and that is a provision to define environmental justice communities in state law for the very first time. It would give community members in environmental justice communities a much more meaningful role in decision-making, making processes about new projects. We talked about, the DA, again, also raised this. So again, there's existing climate law. This is amending that with a racial justice provision. Another amendment is a bill that I actually filed this session, which is an act advancing health equity, which is aimed, actually it's a pretty big piece of legislation. It's aimed at forcing state government to look squarely at whether it is perpetuating racism in its actions. When the state determines where to build a highway, a sewage treatment plant, a biomass plant, when it decides how to allocate education funding, this bill, my bill, wants it to take into account the health equity impacts, the racial equity impacts of that decision. And it requires a health equity impact statement for every major initiative. Again, this isn't defining each individual piece of law, it's laying something over that to say, okay, you're gonna do what you do over here, but when you do it, you have to tell us, tell the state, tell the legislature, tell the public, tell advocates, if it is going to have a positive or negative impact on racial health equity. Other examples of amendments to existing law and policy that I'll just raise very briefly are things like the Family Work and Mobility Act. That looks at legislation around driver's licenses and makes it possible for everyone to get a driver's license. I believe this is an immigrant rights bill. It's also happens to be a public safety bill, a public health bill. Again, that doesn't change all law, but it inserts a provision. Much like a bill I filed around MCAS testing. I think the MCAS is a racist exam. I always have. I've always been opposed. So I filed a bill to ban it during COVID-19, to ban it for 4 years and to put into a process a rethink of the kind of ways that it's high stakes, because the high stakes are only hurting, disproportionately hurting students of color and poor students and students with disabilities. So they are the ones that are losing disproportionately. So again, those are not necessarily new policies whole hog, they are amendments to existing law. And the last I'll talk about in this list is shifting spending priorities. Again, policy happens in the budget, and we basically vote with our values when we vote to spend our dollars in certain ways. The Student Opportunity Act, led by Senator Sonia Chang-Diaz and Senator Jason Lewis, began to shift spending in a way that recognized investment in education as an investment in racial equity. Investing in the promise of education is investing in a ladder out of inequity, out of poverty, when it's done well. So this begins to shift money toward, say, for example, greater investment, especially in districts with disproportionately high poverty rates. So it begins to take these public dollars and put them more equitably focused into districts that need them most. That's an example of a shift in spending priorities. Another example of a shift in spending priorities came this year during the crisis with the extra money spent on the Healthy Incentives Program, or HIP. HIP, you may know, is a program that doubles the food stamp dollar and allows for people who are on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program to go get healthy produce at farmers markets or stores. It turns out that HIP is a wildly successful program, but it also turns out that HIP was not used enough by farmers of color, and it was not located, anchored in by vendors of color or in communities of color. And so with the expansion of HIP, one of the things that we paid a lot of attention to was allowing it to expand. Sure, that's important. Of course, I'm a huge HIP fan, but we don't need more HIP in certain parts of Western Massachusetts, for example. But boy, out in Lynn and Everett and Chelsea, we could use to really bring the promise of this kind of state spending, and that's what we did. And I'm really delighted to tell you that it's far more diverse now as a program than it ever was, and it was recognizing that food security had to have a racial equity lens. And so we shifted the spending of those dollars. Okay, last slide. And I'll bring it down home, just mindful of time. You know, part of the way this gets done is ensuring that constituents have access to government. One of the things, for example, I'm paying attention to with regard to tribal leaders, you know, as we go back into the next session, is to work into the rules of our Senate, and I hope the entire legislature, that tribal leaders have privilege when testifying on tribal related bills. I'm sad to say and angry to say that some of the foremost tribal leaders in our Commonwealth waited hours to testify on the Indigenous agenda bills, because they were not seated as they should be seated, as leaders with jurisdiction that needed to be listened to up front in the hearing. That's just one small example of the way in which we should and can write rules to make sure that to center access and to make sure that the playing field is leveled and equitable for voices of disproportionately affected communities. The second bullet, work inside and outside to ensure accountability. The folks on this call don't need any explanation for this. I do believe that it is my job, though, as a state senator, to reach over and grasp the hands of organizers in the trenches. I was one of those, pounding on people like me to pay attention to my community's interests and needs, again, at the local, state, and national level. And I do believe that we are stronger when we grab hands with each other. And there are lots of ways we can and do and should do more of this in the legislature, by welcoming in briefings and organizing campaigns and making sure that we ourselves are tuned in. And the last, I'll just say, there's a lot of work we should and can do to transform the legislature's policies and workforce. That's internal work. And you know, my team has been engaged in an anti-racism piece of work. This is just my own Senate team. We committed to that, and we are seeing it through, and we're doing our own internal capacity building. The Senate also, as I mentioned, created an equity task force. The Senate also brought on an HR manager of diversity, equity, and inclusion to begin to look at things like hiring and the intern pipeline and all of the ways that we can and should build a more equitable workforce, a more diverse and representative workforce in the Senate. And I will say that the staff of color in the Senate, actually this is in the House, in the Senate, have formed what's called a beacon block. And they are calling the legislature to much needed reform. And so, you know, again, a lot of what we do manifests outward publicly, you know, in terms of the policy or budget work we do, but there's also a lot of work we have to do internally in individual offices, in regions, in the entire body, to bring about more anti-racist processes and procedures and rules so that we can fine-tune ourselves to do this work better. And with that, I will say again, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Senator Comerford. What a great list of examples of the work you're doing and, you know, the ways in which we can really improve in the legislature. So thank you for that. And we're going to open up the floor to the guests. For anyone who has a question, please unmute and ask Senator Comerford. And we do have one in the chat. Emily Plummer asks, is it difficult to work across party lines when working with other people in the State House? And how are you able to find compromise and also feel accomplished in getting progressive legislation pushed through?
Oh, Emily, you're asking the question of the day. I will say, yes, sometimes it is difficult to work across party lines, but I'll also say, unfortunately, that sometimes in the legislature, it's difficult to work between House and Senate. And I don't like saying that, and I don't like that that's the reality. Out here in Western Massachusetts, so the Hampshire Franklin Worcester district, I have 6 reps that I work closely with in the district, and we say all the time, we're not doing what happens in Boston. Out here in Western Massachusetts, there are too few of us. We have a different mindset. We don't do that House Senate stuff. We are gonna lock arms and we're gonna go for our people. I think there's creative tensions in that House Senate, and there's also sometimes creative tensions in the Democrat Republican across the aisle. I will say that through good dialogue in the debate in the Senate, and we have a lot of it, and I have a call tomorrow actually on the mascot bill, trying to go deeper with a colleague who is opposing this, and so therefore one of the reasons I can't move it forward. I will say that we because there are fewer of us, we have deep conversations and we tussle all the time on things, and hopefully that leads to a sharper product. And your second question, how are you able to find compromise and also feel accomplished? This is a big learning edge for me, right? I came into this as an organizer, and I was, as an organizer, pretty resolute in having a very strong picture of what a progressive piece of legislation would look like. Being in the body now for, just a year and a half, again, I'm a newbie, I'm recognizing that, policy is the long game. I don't think that ever makes me want to settle. I never want to settle. And if I start settling, I always say to people, get me out of there, vote me out, because I never, ever want to settle. But I do recognize this arc that we're on. And I see a horizon, and I'm going to get us, or for my constituents, get us there. And sometimes I can't get there by leaps, but by God, I'll get there by inches. And sometimes that's the way we build policy. Again, it's not always the way we build policy. I think the Reform, Shift, and Build Act, the police reform, was a concerted effort by the Senate president to bring something meaningful in the Senate that was not an inch. Those were some leaps in there, in terms of qualified immunity or the standards in training, the accountability measures, even the mental health provisions that I disproportionately worked on. So, but it is a balance.
And we have one more question. I think we have time for one more question. And it's from Ms. Lisa Olney. And she asks, how can we advocate effectively for bills in conference if our own senators are not on the committee?
Yeah, really great question. Your senators still work for you. And it's their job, my job, to convey my constituents' thinking. So, for example, I'm not currently serving on a conference committee, but boy, those conference committees hear from me. They hear in the climate committee that we don't want a biomass provision because I have constituents that are locking arms with Springfield organizers to block a biomass plant, for example. They hear from me all the time. Again, I don't have to have a seat at that conference committee to have a voice in that conference committee. I also talk to Senate leadership, Senate Ways and Means leadership, Senate president, with the things that my constituents are talking to me about in terms of the conference committees, for example, that are moving now. So I agree that it can be confusing, but you still have a voice through your representative and your senator. Even if they're not on that committee, they can make your voice known. And I forward things directly a lot of the time. Sometimes I aggregate it in my own testimony, but it's up to us to be squeaky wheels for our people and to not settle and to make sure that the distinct needs and interests of our district are going to be in that conference committee report. And these, I just will say one more second, these are particularly important because when they come out of conference committee, it's an up or down vote by someone like me. So that's an agonizing moment. So all the work is now, and it's super urgent because I won't have another shot at that. The conference committees, I'm going to have a lot of time with the budget relative to that to shape it, but not a lot of time with the conference committees. Yes, squeaky wheels for our people. That is it, man. That is the job.
What a great quote of the night. I really like that. Let's all be the squeaky wheels.
Right.
Thank you so much, Senator Comerford.
You're welcome. Thank you. And Samantha, you're right. Testimony is, of course, what I write all the time. You know, that's a written, aggregated list of demands. We send that in, but I also send in little missives like, heard from 15 more people, hoping that we're going to get that biomass provision out, you know. So it's exactly. Like you do the big stuff, you arrange the calls with your colleagues, and then you just keep nudging. Again, and people are the reason that we nudge, your passion and your hopes and interests.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Senator Comerford, and great questions, everybody.
Pleasure.
Going to move on to our third speaker, Damali Vido. So Damali Vido is a mom. She's a community advocate and an at-large city councilor in Chelsea. She is driven by a call to uplift the voices of her community that are often excluded from life-altering political decisions. She leads with the richness of a lived experience as a disabled Afro-Latina from Chelsea. She is the proud daughter of a former union maintenance worker and her courageous mother who left New York, escaping a domestic violence situation in search for a better life. Currently serving her third term as city councilor, Damali made history by becoming the first woman to lead the city as council president for 2 consecutive terms. She has used her platform on the city council to center the most vulnerable residents. In 2020, Damali launched a state representative campaign for the 2nd Suffolk district that encompasses all of Chelsea and most of Charlestown. While she was unable to unseat her incumbent, her high-spirited campaign drove the highest voter turnout Chelsea had seen in a state representative race in at least 14 years. As the only woman serving at large, Damali remains committed to working families and ensuring they have access to affordable housing, healthcare, economic security, safe working conditions, and high-quality education. Please join me in welcoming Chelsea City Councilor Damali Vido.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Samantha. Excited to be here. I'll get right to it. So my name is Damali Vido. My official title is City Councilor at Large, but I do identify as activist councilorette. I'm here today to discuss how I legislate in the fight against institutionalized racism. Now, before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge that legislating in the fight against institutionalized racism as a woman and having an additional identifier, such as being Black, of color, immigrant, Muslim, LGBTQ, disabled, having an accent or looking different than what is socially accepted, it's a fight in and of its own. Because the very system of municipal governments that I'm expected to use as a tool against systemic oppression was not designed for people that meet my demographics. And so stepping up to lead means not only are you trying to legislate for different policy positions, but that the mere act of representation poses an active challenge, not only to who is in power, but how power operates. And I don't say this to instill fear, but to remind and empower us in the knowing that we are not alone and that we get to decide what power is to us. For me, power is our collective beliefs. It's in how we treat our neighbors. It's in how we treat the most vulnerable among us. I believe that government is for everyone, and if used properly and with the right representation, can begin to dismantle the systems that have disenfranchised so many. So as I share my story of how I legislate, I invite you to get comfy in your seats and take a trip with me to the 02150. Chelsea is a 1.8 square miles long. It is home to probably about 45,000 residents, though on record it states about 35,000. We are the smallest city in the Commonwealth, but the 2nd densest in the state and the 26th densest city in the entire country. We have long been an immigrant community and a gateway city where our schools speak 28 known languages and people have come here from every corner of the world. According to the last US census, 45% of our residents are foreign born. We have folks from Cambodia, Bosnia, Puerto Rico, Somalia, Vietnam, Irish, We have Italians, we have Jewish, Ethiopian, and in recent years, we've had a huge influx of Central American folks who have fled the unrest in their country. So that's El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. In the 1950s, just to give some history, to connect the North and the South Shore, the building of the Tobin Bridge split our city in two. At two great fires, political corruption, going bankrupt and going into receivership, and you have hundreds and hundreds of families being displaced disaster after disaster, both man-made and natural. As we built ourselves up from the woes of the past, our immigrant city became a hotspot destination for people who could no longer afford Boston's exuberant rents. And gentrification and the displacement of hardworking families that contributed to the social fabric of our diverse community was threatened. I was elected in 2016 on a platform of development without displacement. I drove the highest voter turnout in 12 years coming out of the gate, topping the ticket in the last municipal election. I was the first woman and a woman of color to serve 2 consecutive terms as council president. And I also just came in second for a state rep race where I generated more votes in the state rep race Chelsea has seen in years. So I don't say this to show off. Yes, I do. No, I don't. But to demonstrate that my growing support year after year is synonymous with my advocacy and policy stance. I was committed to finding solutions to our housing crisis and how to get a hold of the huge residential developments that kept coming into different parts of our community with these luxury amenities that were posing a threat to smaller landlords and driving up rents in our communities. Forcing people to double, triple family up in one apartment. Youth homeless population began increasing, and folks were forced to deal with new landlords coming in and jacking up rents by $500 from one month to another, displacing them or converting multifamily homes into condos. So, well, a 2-bedroom apartment that once was home to a family of 4 was now a bachelor pad for a single professional with a home office or a gym. Despite the condo conversions, the city estimates that about 75% of our units in Chelsea are renter occupied. Of these units, many are home to multi-generational living and undignified living conditions due to absentee landlords. In other words, we had a housing crisis, y'all. And even in securing affordable housing, the formula that is used by the federal government with the area median income, the AMI, is based on the assumption that the average family in Chelsea earns $109,000 a year, when the actual median income for Chelsea is $50,000. So that even in our attempt to protect those of lesser means, we couldn't. Now, I'm here to talk legislation and to talk about my experiences. I wanted to give you a backstory. But I want to talk about a little bit of my experience in driving policy. I just want to share a very short story. I'm driven by my lived experiences and I drive for justice. And there's a personal story that continues to move me in that direction. In 2018, I took in a teenager after her family became homeless. She was in her junior year of high school, and as the state moved her mother and her 2 younger siblings from scattered site to motel in different parts of the state, she was falling behind. She was a great student who was so appreciative of the community she had in Chelsea that she wanted to go to college and return to Chelsea High to be an English teacher. I was honored to provide a home for her and witness her transition from food and housing insecurity to having access to a bed, a room, food, space, a home. Her passion for homelessness advocacy and the intimate details she shared with me in confidence about the logistical difficulties of living in a motel while trying to succeed at school, maintain relationships and be healthy, have access to food, have stayed with me and put my commitment to housing on overdrive. Witnessing homelessness so up close and personal, I had to do something. So yeah, we passed local legislation to protect tenant rights through condo conversion ordinances. And yes, we required developers to provide more affordable units through inclusionary zoning ordinance, but we needed more. So I and a couple of community leaders convened a roundtable to discuss housing, anti-displacement specifically, not just to protect those displaced from their homes, but to support those who were at risk of being displaced from the only city that they knew. We brought in partners in the field of legal aid, universities, grassroots organizations, community development, city staff, elected officials, regional allies. We even had someone there from healthcare. These were agencies that traditionally had not worked together. Yet here we were working on one goal. And to be honest with you, it was extremely hard to get on the same page at first because everyone is so used to doing things their way. But our goal drove us, and it led us to continue to work with one another despite the many obstacles that we face. We call it the ADR. It's the Anti-Displacement Roundtable. So if you hear me say ADR, that's what I'm referring to. The ADR, the roundtable, was to combat displacement and prevent homelessness. We wanted to organize. We could organize all we could locally, but how are we leveraging our power here to support state level housing policies that protect the tenants? And how else could we put our heads together to address the housing crisis here? It wasn't popular to be a bold city councilor and active at the ADR. Developers fought against housing activists and what we were creating. I was advocating for rent control at the State House while people ridicule me locally for taking such a bold stance. And a lot of elected officials, I know the district attorney references, a lot of elected officials wouldn't take those actions. They're so concerned with being reelected. They wouldn't have taken an action like that. They would have attempted to probably politicize the movement. But I believe if you're an elected official and you have the power to affect change, to serve people or save people, it is our obligation. So we were meeting monthly, the ADR, to work toward a common goal, anti-displacement. We were building consensus and reviewing zoning and discussing campaigns, and boom, the pandemic hit. Here we were organizing for housing, and the world just came tumbling down on us. At the beginning of the pandemic, and I'm not sure how many of you all know, but the state was advising municipalities to not report their individual COVID infection numbers. So locally, we resorted to our own networks to track the infection rate in terms of Chelsea and how it compared to other communities across the state. Our chief of police coordinated with chiefs of police in other communities and gathered information, and that's how we were able to see that Chelsea had become the hotspot for Massachusetts, hosting the highest rate of infection and death per capita in Massachusetts. At the time, we were hired in some of the hardest hit areas in New York, while New York was the epicenter of Corona in the country. And so the 02150, home to extremely high asthma, cancer, and other comorbidities, had a public health crisis on their hands. And I mean, we can blame climate change, air quality, the fact that 80% of our workforce are essential workers. We can talk about our density, industrial pollution, underserved transit. But what we knew was a definite driving force was overcrowded multi-generational homes, entire families forced to live in rooms due to the high cost of rent. And so dad going to work and exposing himself to COVID meant coming home and exposing daughter, wife, abuela, tia. We learned that social distancing was a privilege and that commuters, essential workers, and housing insecure folks couldn't access it. Why was our Black, brown, low-income, immigrant, non-English speaking community getting infected and dying at such a higher rate than other places in the world? Furthermore, why was the state administration trying to keep the infection numbers under wraps? How would we know where we stand? How would we know how to address it? Where are our resources? Where's the PPE? Where was testing? And then the light goes off in your head and you're like, wait a minute. We have a mechanism to organize. We've been meeting with this ADR for the past year. Here's a system that we created towards one goal. So I partnered up with a constituent who is also a public health professor, and we wrote a letter to the governor. Through connections we made through the ADR, we solicited signatures from elected officials, nonprofit organizations, civic groups, state senators, reps, activists, and to underline our efforts and the severity of the times, we even got the presidents of both MGH and Beth Israel Deaconess to sign on to our letter to the governor demanding funds and resources for Chelsea. It seemed the state wanted to respond with a blanket approach, but communities like Chelsea that were disproportionately affected needed a little bit more. Within a week of sending that letter, we had PPE, we had planned for testing for residents, we secured emergency funding for a hotel to quarantine folks that would otherwise pose a threat to their families, and the National Guard was deployed to assist us with food distribution. We used some of our reserves and implemented the state's first rental assistance program for residents of Chelsea. The program was strategically designed to prioritize the most vulnerable, so that if you were elderly, a mom with young children, a veteran, disabled, or people who wouldn't traditionally qualify for these rental assistance programs, there would be assistance for you. It was crafted specifically. The way that the policy was, we want to support everybody, and we did it carefully to make sure that we were as inclusive as possible. And so when the state reimbursed our emergency funds, we reinvested it back into more programs for small businesses and more vulnerable communities that needed the support. And when the eviction moratorium was due to expire, the ADR continued to advocate for more funds for housing in communities that were hit harder than others. Our advocacy landed us with a meeting with the governor and members of his administration last week, where we made our pleas. We explained that the ADR is a multi-member group of regional allies, and that individually we'd exhausted all of our resources. And like the disasters of the past, we didn't want hundreds of Chelsea families being displaced. Because while COVID-19 may be a natural disaster, being complicit in its emergency response leaves space for blame and accountability. So the work of the ADR remains a work in progress. As we await notice from the state on our list of demands, we're requesting $10 million to support RAF applications and support frontline organizations dealing with emergency housing displacements, a rental assistance program, food distribution, grocery shopping carts. We literally give out cards for folks to have the dignity to buy their own foods. Small business support were all made possible due to the efforts of our coalition building and working together on a common goal and putting pressure where it merits by exhausting every possible channel and bringing attention to the smallest city in the Commonwealth. So what lessons have I learned? I'm in 5. One is be creative. The systems that we are to utilize to address the institutionalized inequities in environment, education, housing, health, etc., may not have been created with people like me or you in mind, but there's an opportunity. Because COVID has exposed vulnerabilities in many of our systems that are begging to be seen. And we have an opportunity to redefine or reroute agendas to be based on the needs of the people that have been disenfranchised from it. Housing insecurity wasn't specific to COVID, but COVID made it so it can no longer be ignored. But we have to be flexible in any preconceived notions we have of what power or legislating looks like. Because if we are not to be bold in our practice and do what we've always done, then we are always going to get what we've always gotten. Second, be bold. As Black Lives Matter yard signs and posters and marches are underway in a hood near you, what does Black Lives Matter mean when it comes to legislation? Many of these affluent towns with BLM signs on their lawn are the same folks that come out to oppose low-income housing when we try to house those very Black and brown families they say matter. What is the courageous step we are willing to take as legislators to put our money where our mouth is and demonstrate that Black and brown lives matter through policy? So that priority funding is given to the communities that have been ravaged, not by COVID, but by the inequities that have long existed that made it so COVID couldn't be ignored. Being bold is, I'm sorry?
Sorry to interrupt, Councillor Rideau. Wondering if we might be able to list your last 3 lessons before we move on to our last speaker, Aisha. Want to make sure we're able to get
I
to
literally have maybe a minute left.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. I just want to, So being bold isn't just about cool tweets and photo ops. It's not allowing an eviction moratorium to expire without a plan B or during a historic unemployment rate. Community after community in this country, we see the ones hardest hit by COVID are the same one being hit by housing, criminal injustice, environmental injustice. And so to truly legislate while fighting systemic inequities raises the question of what is there to be meek about? Be real. We as women lead differently. By the nature of who we are as humans, we tend to be more inclusive than our male counterparts. The pressures of conforming or joining consensus may seem desirable, but what do your values say? Be consistent. It can be draining and exhausting to be the woman of color who is always standing up for the community, especially in the interest of Black and brown people. I stuck to the ADR through the good, the bad, and the ugly, fighting for anti-displacement for the city against the flow of the current of the status quo. It turns out that being willing to stick through it, despite its wide acceptance, worked in our favor. The organizing tool we created toward housing became the same instrument we used to solicit support from the state for COVID when we needed it most. And then the last one is just to be empowered. If nothing else, be empowered to take actions, be empowered to stand up for injustice, be empowered to run for office. These times call for bold action, be empowered to be bold, be empowered to ride to the beat of your own drum, be empowered to lead with your values. Don't ask permission to run for office, be empowered to follow your gut. Be empowered to legislate your values. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Councillor. We really appreciate your time and your inspiring words. You've been doing some amazing work in Chelsea, and it's been such a COVID hotspot, and without your work, it certainly would have been more so. And yeah, we just really appreciate you coming on tonight.
Of course,
Speak
thank
with
you.
us about
Thank
it.
you.
And so for now, we're going to skip questions so we can get to Aisha's presentation. But for anyone who would like to stick around and ask questions afterwards, we will keep the line open. Please do stay. Please come join the conversation. We're happy to talk. I'm happy to get those questions. And so with that, we'll move on to school committee member Aisha Wilson. So from growing up in Jefferson Park public housing development in a single parent household to attending public school in Cambridge, Aisha Wilson has had a wealth of personal experiences with the issues facing her community. She achieved her bachelor's and master's degree in social work and an associate's degree in human services. Throughout her life and career, Aisha has been advocating for and engaging with the community, and specifically young people, with the Workforce Youth Program, YWCA Cambridge, NAACP Cambridge branch, and Emerge Massachusetts. She's the perfect role model for young people who want to give back to their community. Many of the projects she has worked on have been aimed at instilling these skills and knowledge in youth, creating the next generation of activists, advocates, and legislators. Please join me in welcoming Cambridge School Committee member and my fellow Emerge classmate and friend, Aisha Wilson.
Thank you so much, Samantha, and thank you to the Massachusetts Women Political Caucus for, again, having this panel, inviting me to be a part of it, and, you know, just sharing the space with my fellow sisters in service. Thank you to all my Emerge sisters who are on this call, class of 2019. I'm so happy to see all of you. And so I think we will get right into the presentation. I will make it very quick because I know that we are running short on time. So from protest to power, what am I doing in Cambridge to tackle systemic racism? And you can go to the next slide. So just to take a little bit of a step back, why did I decide to run for school committee? So as we heard in the bio from my, that Samantha read, I currently work as a senior teacher council with the Cambridge Housing Authority with a program called the Workforce Program. My site is actually based in the high school of Cambridge and Gelatin, which is our one and only high school, which I also graduated from, and I'm the class of 2000. And so what I saw is something that I put here as being a spirit murdering experience for our Black and brown kids. So Patricia Williams coined the term spirit murdering to argue that racism is more than just a physical pain. Racism robs people of color of their humanity, dignity, and leaves personal, psychological, and spiritual injuries. And so what that really means, or what that looked like for me in the hallways in our schools, is seeing young people, especially kids of color, in our hallways, and not engaging in class. And I would often felt like I was honorary security and trying to shuttle kids to class, like, hey, the bell has rang, why are you still in the hallway? Like, get to class, and finding out they didn't see themselves as being a scholar in those spaces, that they didn't feel valued by their teacher, that they didn't feel like the educational experience was for them. And so because of that, I felt like instantly their spirit was being murdered right before my eyes, and that somebody had to do something to change this. And so for me, I started to ask the question, what does equity and access look like for Black, Indigenous, people of color, especially our students in our schools? Next slide, please. So these are just the photos of some of the things that I have engaged. I always engage my young people, right? My young people was like my street team. And this was powerful because as soon as they knew that I wanted to run, they were like, we got you. We are going to talk to our friends and our family and get out the vote. And so these are events that I participated in. There's a photo down there with a bunch of young people who were out there door knocking for me, because it was powerful that they saw themselves in somebody who's going to represent for them. And that to me was really a powerful opportunity and a powerful movement for them to be civically engaged, for them to understand that through me, their voice does matter, and how will they empower the right to vote and register to vote and do all the things that they need to do to service their community, and definitely get to the voices of the people who are policymakers, who actually make the decisions that change and represent for their lives, and how do they actually have the seat at the table. Next slide. We're going to just click on this YouTube, and this goes to, before you click on it, sorry, Sam. The Black Student Union at Cambridge and Latin got revamped. I was actually I participated in the Black Student Union. I'm part of the class of 2000, and it got revamped in 2017. And many of our young people openly vocalized the fact that there were a lot of racist things that were happening in school for them, and that they just didn't want to bear it anymore. And how do they raise awareness around what they are experiencing, and just shine some light on it, and also say that this is wrong. So we're just going to watch just a quick, like, 2-minute video of one of their desk series from the Black Student Union of Cambridge and Latin.
Can everyone see it okay? Or YouTube?
I don't think the volume is on. If you could turn, you might have to go to the top and share the volume, the sound.
I wonder if this is something that's not going to work.
There's a hole in
Thank you.
I've been hiding. I've been strong for so long that I'm blind. Is there a place I can go where the lonely river flows, with fear ends and faith begins? Hallelujah, hallelujah, let me in. I've been praying, but I'm paying for your sins. Oh, won't you give me a sign before I lose my mind? Oh, hallelujah, let me in. Oh, let me in. Oh, let me in. Oh, won't you give me a sign before I lose my mind? Oh, hallelujah, let me in.
Thank you. So you could actually go back to that slide. Yes, stay right there for a second. Back one. Yes. Oh. So as you could see, and there's many, if you Google the Black Student Union of Cambridge and Latin, you'll see several videos. They are pretty lengthy, but that's their desk series in terms of just what they have experienced, their raw emotions, their engagement in the community, how they have lifted their voices. And this here, you see the Black Lives Matter flag, and I will actually talk a little bit more about that on one of the next slides. But we had passed a motion to get this Black Lives Matter flag raised in June after the murdering of George Floyd, and and Breonna Taylor, and just thinking about how do we operate and service our youth, but also raise their voices when they are the ones that are on the ground and experiencing such disparities at such higher rates, and they're experiencing them within our schools. Next slide. This right here is another reason why I decided to run for school committee, is because we look at these MCAS scores, and I just showcase these 2 scores alone for the 3rd grade literacy for African American Black students, and then versus white students. So just imagine, as a school committee member, you sit in front of 100 Black families and you say, we only expect 40% of you, 47% of you to actually pass the literacy 3rd grade MCAS. What happens to the other 53% of those families or those students? What resources are we putting in place for them, when we're saying on the flip side of that, for white students, there's a 77 target rate, in that they have met 80% capacity of white students have been able to pass, either meet expectations or be proficient in MCAS. To me, this is where we have the injustices. This is where, for us to even publicize these numbers, because this is public, this is on our website, this is insulting, this is racism, this is systemic racism, this is problematic. And that if we don't have 100% passing, especially in Cambridge where we are so resource rich, and we are putting up $30,000 per pupil in our schools, to say that we are failing our Black and brown kids in these numbers is insulting. And to me, I feel like it's criminal negligence. And so my reason for running is to make sure that these numbers get increased, because we need to put in the right resources to make this happen. If our kids cannot read, we understand that from 1st grade to 3rd grade, they are learning to read. From 3rd grade and higher, they're reading to, or I'm sorry, for 1st to 2nd grade, they are learning to read. 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, it's more like reading to learn. And so if you are below average in your reading levels and abilities, how are you going to learn moving forward? Next slide. These are 8th grade math MCAS scores. Again, the same thing, right? Even lower. If you can't read, how are you gonna do math? Right? So when we look at this target percentage of 25%, and of course we know for 2020, MCAS was waived. We did not offer MCAS, so we don't have scores for 2020. But it also just goes back to the systemic racist act, or that the MCAS puts in play, and how it is marginalizing our most vulnerable scholars. And even when we look at the numbers for students with disabilities, students who are on free or reduced lunch, our marginalized populations, those numbers are significantly lower than the counterparts, whether it's white, Asian students who are not on free or reduced lunch. Next slide. These are just a few motions. I passed several motions with some of my colleagues, which I am excited about as a 1st term school committee member. But as you see here, the BSU students, it was a motion that they put in place that they wanted to see passed, was the Black Lives Matter flag to be raised. We put a banner above the school, the high school. And we also did a flag over the flagpole, which is by the library, which is adjacent to the school. And so this was their day of celebration of that flag being, and banner being lifted and raised. And myself and the mayor, Sambal Siddiqui, co-sponsored that motion. On the left side, we have on the right side, we have, as Senator Comerford had spoke to earlier, the racist school mascots, and really abandoning that and getting that out of here. We also put in a motion to not have any affiliation with our alumni association, which uses the Warriors logo. And one of our Indigenous students, Madeline Wood, class of 2020, she put in an op-ed in late August in the Cambridge Chronicle, speaking to why this is so offensive and why we as Cambridge should not have affiliation with our alumni association if they are going to continue to print material on using this racist mascot. Next slide. So now what is next? Well, one, I'm going to run for re-election. I should have put that in bold somewhere at the top. So I look forward to an endorsement again from the Massachusetts Women's Political Caucus. But we have a lot of work to do, and I think with this pandemic, we have seen that, the disproportionate rates of the injustices and the inequities that are facing our Black and Brown students, our most marginalized, our students with disabilities, is sad. It's emotional. And we know that these things were happening pre-COVID, right? So now that COVID has exacerbated exactly all these things that are happening, and we knew, the inequities of broadband and internet service and access to computers and laptops and all those things, that there's a lot of work to do. So I start off with saying, talking about Dr. Benita Love, who talks about education can't save us, we have to save education. And we need to now freedom dream. We really need to think about how are we going to take advantage of this time and not let this time take advantage of us, right? How do we tackle it on, making sure that we don't go back to business as usual, because usual was not okay. So we really need to rev it up, and we need to be in a place of empowering our kids of color, our educators of color, our families of color. And so what does that look like? How do we freedom dream? How do we look at our curriculum? How do we make sure that we're centering the voices of our BIPOC families and community? How do we power share? What does that look like? And as we in Cambridge, again, a resource rich, we are not here talking about laying teachers off. We are talking in our school committee meeting last night, a $17 million COVID relief estimate that we're not even blinking an eye with, right? Like, we have this and we can actually make that happen. And so what does that look like in a community like ours when we are failing our Black and Brown kids at such high rates? Right? There's a lot of work that we need to do to intentionally dismantle systemic racism in Cambridge, but across our Commonwealth and across our country. Obviously, ending standardized testing, understanding that that has disproportionately marginalized Black and Brown families and disability and students with disabilities for forever. I remember I was the guinea pig to MCAS as being the class of 2000, and we failed back then over 20 years ago. So how has this continued to move us forward and us not have this be ended? As a social worker, I'm really happy to say that we approved 5 new social workers in our budget this year, but we need to do more. We still don't have 1 full-time social worker in every school. So we still have work to do with that. What does it look like to have social emotional learning when it comes to culturally responsive teaching? How are we making sure that our professional development is really matching the language that we use? Cambridge loves to talk the right things. We love to talk about equity first. We love to talk about dismantling racism, but what does that look like in the work that we do in social emotional, culturally responsive teaching? How are we making sure that our educators have the tools that they need to be well equipped to support our young people in those classrooms? To see them as the full child, to understand the trauma, how COVID has impacted their homes and their families, and what does that mean when they show up or not, right? And how do we support those young people? Implementing internship, yeah. Sorry, I'm finishing up. These are my last 2.
Yeah, just a couple more seconds. Sounds
Thank
good.
you. How do we implement internships for all of our juniors and seniors to complete and have done for graduation, and thinking about that from a remote standpoint? We are dealing with remote work right now, and this is the reality, and this will probably be our reality for the next couple of years, right? So there's a lot of work that we need to do to think about how we could be creative and innovative and creating opportunities for our young people to still have skills upon graduation. And then, of course, talking about universal pre-K. And that is a huge job. That has been something that has been on the docket for quite a few years, and I won't stop until I get to that point. So I just want to thank you all for this time this evening, and I am free to answer any questions that you all have. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Aisha. I just want to thank all the speakers for being here. My name is Caitlin Clark, and I am the MWPC PAC co-chair along with Amy Diamond. When we set out to do this about 2 months ago, we were like, oh, it's a Zoom fundraiser, you know, it'll be fairly straightforward. It definitely was a labor of love for us. So thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to the MWPC board, the PAC board, the executive committee, our wonderful interns on the call. They will tell you they've been working on this day in and day out for the last month and a half. So thank you all so much. And thank you again to our speakers. You raised some amazing points about the legislative process, and I've definitely learned a lot tonight that I'm going to take going forward. We also want to thank you for everyone who attended and you showed up and you donated, and you really took in what our speakers had to say. And I just hope that you share with your networks that we had this fundraiser going on, and you'll be able to share the links to once we get off of the call. So this is unfortunately the end of our From Protest to Power series, but please make sure you keep advocating and donating and applying some of the things you've learned from our speakers over these 2 weeks. You can follow the MWPC PAC on social media to hear more about opportunities to engage with us and our endorsed candidates. And of course, November 3rd, make sure you vote. Please also make sure to join the MWPC at our next event post-election. It's a virtual gala on November 17th, 6 to 7 p.m. via Zoom. It's the MWPC celebration of elected women of color. We will be honoring Mayor Yvonne Spicer, Boston City Councilor Lydia Edwards, and Pittsfield City Councilor Helen Moon. So details and registration will be sent out via our newsletter and available on our website. So we'll be around for a couple minutes in case you have any additional questions for our speakers. But for the rest of you, thank you all so much for attending and have a wonderful night.
For anyone sticking around, do you have any questions you'd like to ask Aisha or Damali? Alice, I see you raising your hand. Please unmute yourself and tell us your question. You can unmute yourself, Alice, by clicking on the unmute button on the lower left-hand side of your screen.
Hi, can you hear me now? I just want to give an extra thank you to the Mass Women Political Caucus and to the speakers. They were all really inspiring and spot on in their messaging, and I just really admire their work, and I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you, Alice.
And I also meant to say that I have on my Justice Ginsburg shirt too.
I love this theme tonight.
Love it. Yes,
great.
I meant to show that earlier.
Oh my gosh. You and DA Rollins are matching. Aha.
Absolutely.
You know, Aisha, there was a question that was sent in on Google Forms that I think it would be really interesting to know. What concerns do you have with the youth that you're working with about their listening and watching our current federal government? How do you think that we can help them avoid internalizing some of those lessons, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, some of my students and I have been having these conversations already and engaging in like what's happening, what might the day after election day look like. And, you know, we just have to, and I was just on a panel earlier this week on Monday with the Becky's Anonymous and talking about this as well and thinking, you know, how do we show compassion for our young people? How do we still think about the fight at the local level, like the things that we can do to be civically engaged, you know, especially if the election does not go in favor of what we, the people, actually need. How do we still show up on the local level to get the job done? How do we still raise the voices and center the voices of our young people? What does this mean specifically for our Black and Brown kids? Because as we know, this is a critical time. These last 4 years have been specifically on Black and Brown bodies. And so, you know, what does that mean and what could that mean and shape for the next 4 years if Trump is reelected. But then what does it mean if Biden, Harris, you know, and I think there's a lot of excitement, and I think, you know, there's a lot of hope, and yes, I see you, Caitlin, and there's a lot of hope, and there's a lot of joy and just having a Black woman vice president hit the stage. And, you know, there's just so much joy there and optimism that we're trying to really stay there and not really sit in the negative thoughts that are probably shaping all of our minds right now, but really how do we keep that hope alive and how do we just get out the vote? So I had young people engaging in phone banking, which has been exciting. I have engaged in phone banking myself. And then we just have them, you know, voting early, registering to vote, you know, making sure that they know and have a plan and that their family has a plan for actually voting. So that has been a really critical part of, you know, their knowledge and their engagement, and even stuff that they're doing within their school to engage the larger school community as well.
I love that, you know, sitting really in that positive place of hope and making those phone calls. I mean, let's get Biden and Harris elected.
Yes. I mean, at this point, all we have is hope, right? Like that's all we're really dealing with. And we have to sit with that, and we need to be comfortable and joyful in that moment of the uncertainty, but also in the optimism, because, you know, it's looking good, even though, you know, the federal administration looks crazy right now. I mean, I think where we will be is a positive place. So that's my hope.
That's so exciting that they're phone banking at that age too, you know, even though they can't vote yet.
Right.
I didn't even know about phone banking at that age. So I think that's really cool that they're growing up, you know, with that ability. And that's such a huge set of skills too, to talk to strangers on the phone. That's so weird, you know, at first,
Yes.
but that's wonderful. So
yeah, a lot of these kids actually door knocked for me, and it was their first time going to a stranger's door, like, hey, vote for my teacher. And they're, you know, and so yeah, they're getting out of that shell and getting into that comfort zone of like empowering others to hear and learn and feel motivated by just seeing a young person at your door or hearing a young person on the other end of the phone. And so if they're there spending that time doing this work, it must be for a good reason. So
definitely. Are there any other folks on the line here who would like to ask a question to Aisha? All right. Looks like we're wrapping up. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Thank you all.
Good night.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Good night.